In the clear skies over Karachi, a routine flight suddenly turns into a grave emergency. The plane, with its eerily silent engines, rapidly descends towards the sprawling urban core below. In the cockpit, the pilots struggle with the controls, but their efforts to regain altitude wane as the ground looms ever closer. What happened? Here's what we know. May 22, 2020. Today's story begins at Lahore International Airport in Pakistan. It's 12:30 p.m. On ramp, an Airbus A320 of Pakistan International Airlines is preparing to depart for Karachi International Airport. This domestic flight, covering the route between Lahore and Karachi, takes approximately 2 hours. And since it connects Pakistan's two most populated cities, it is one of the country's busiest and most popular routes. The aircraft, a widely used Airbus A320, was built in 2004. By the date of Flight 8303, it was nearly 16 years old and had operated under China Eastern Airlines until 2014. Later, on October 31, 2014, Pakistan International Airlines leased this aircraft. It is powered by two CFM56 engines and can seat between 140 and 180 passengers. Later, passengers completed the boarding process, settling into their seats. After closing the doors and securing the cabin, the aircraft began to push back from the gate with the help of a tug vehicle. Once in position, the engines were started, and the aircraft slowly moved towards the assigned runway. At 1:05 p.m., the plane took off from Lahore International Airport, expected to arrive in Karachi around 2:45 p.m. The plane was under the command of Captain Shahad Gul, an experienced pilot with 24 years in the aviation industry and over 17,000 flight hours, including 4,700 hours in the Airbus A320. Accompanying him was First Officer Usman Azam, about whom little is known. Over an hour into the flight, it continued routinely as it headed towards Karachi. The crew, consisting of 6 flight attendants, was responsible for the safety of the 91 passengers on board. As they approached the destination airport, the flight remained uneventful, with passengers unaware of any unusual situation as the descent towards Karachi began. The descent was initially planned along a standard arrival route, followed by an instrument landing system approach to runway 25 left. However, Karachi Air Traffic Control unexpectedly authorized a shortcut through a waypoint called Makli. This shortcut significantly reduced the distance of the usual approach route. During the descent, cockpit concentration was not as it should be, as the pilots were engrossed in a discussion about the virus and its global disruptive effects. This conversation also covered the impact of the virus on their families and the world, distracting them from their flight duties. This distraction prevented the pilots from noticing that the descent rate was too slow for the shortened approach they were instructed to follow. When the aircraft passed Makli waypoint, it should have been at around 5,000 feet to align with a proper 3-degree glide slope. However, the flight was at an altitude of approximately 9,800 feet and traveling at 245 knots, significantly above the standard approach parameters. Realizing their altitude and speed were excessive, the pilots reduced the engines to idle and deployed the spoilers, causing the plane to descend more steeply. To further increase the descent rate and reduce speed, they extended the landing gear. Despite these measures, the plane continued approaching the runway at excessive speed. Observing the aircraft's altitude and speed, Air Traffic Control asked the pilots if they needed more miles to land, offering the possibility of a longer approach. But the pilots declined, insisting they felt confident in the situation despite the apparent risks. As they continued their high-speed approach, the controller offered the option of performing an orbit, a 360 turn that could help them lose altitude. But again, the pilots ignored the controller's advice. Closer to the runway, the pilots aligned with the glide path but were still flying too fast, triggering an overspeed warning. In a perplexing move, they retracted the landing gear a few kilometers before landing and extended the flaps, despite the high speed. The approach controller, aiming to facilitate a safe landing, transmitted a landing clearance without transferring the pilots to the tower frequency. Moments later, the aircraft landed without the landing gear extended, causing severe scraping on the runway with the engines and tail. In a frantic response, the pilots initiated a go-around, lifting the damaged plane back into the air. However, the engines were too damaged by the impact and began failing one after another. As the plane circled for another landing attempt, the second engine failed. At this point, the crew deployed the ram air turbine, providing minimal emergency power. This emergency system keeps the plane controllable even during a dual-engine failure. Nonetheless, in this critical moment, the plane was rapidly losing altitude. With each passing second, the situation became more dire. The controller, closely monitoring the flight's trajectory, instructed them to maintain 3,000 feet, but the plane was already below 2,000 feet and descending. Amid the desperate situation, the pilots attempted to prolong their glide, aiming for the runway. For a brief moment, it seemed they might succeed, but tragically, the plane was at insufficient altitude and speed to reach the runway safely. In its final moments, Flight 8303 crashed into a residential area, just 1,140 meters from runway 25 left. If the plane had been able to travel just 300 meters further, it would have cleared the residential area, potentially mitigating the loss of life and destruction. Tragically, 97 of the 99 people on board perished, including all crew members. On the ground, only 4 were injured, but 1 later died in the hospital. Additionally, the incident received widespread media attention, questioning whether it was due to mechanical failure, pilot error, or another cause. Maintenance records showed that the aircraft had been grounded for 46 days, not due to technical issues, but because of reduced flight demand during the pandemic. It then returned to service 2 weeks before the crash and had flown 6 times without problems. Regarding the landing gear, it appeared to function correctly before the initial landing, making mechanical issues seem unlikely. Another possibility is pilot malice, but this seems improbable, as the pilots could have crashed the plane directly without first attempting to land on the runway. The third theory, pilot error, gained traction when the cockpit voice and flight data recorders were analyzed in France. The pilots had not followed standard procedures, were distracted by a conversation about the pandemic, and failed to control their altitude during the approach. They also ignored the controller's advice and seemed fixated on landing, leading to errors like retracting the landing gear prematurely and ignoring warnings. Post-crash investigations revealed shocking details about the qualifications of Pakistan International Airlines pilots. Many were disciplined for having dubious licenses, leading to the airline's ban in the European Union, the UK, and the US. A national investigation found that of 860 active pilots in Pakistan, 260 had suspect licenses, with 50 confirmed as fraudulent. For now, the final report is awaited to conclusively determine the cause of this tragedy and whether it was due to the pilot's personal distractions or incompetence due to fraudulent credentials.